Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. I am Brian Zimmerman with Becker's Hospital Review. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. We will also have a series of audience polling questions today during the webinar. When we reach each poll slide, the poll question will pop up automatically on your screen. Our speakers will give a few seconds for you to select an answer from the options on your screen and click Submit. Thank you in advance for your participation. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. In about a week following the webinar, we'll be sending all registrants a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Gail Peace is President and CEO of Ludi, Inc. Gail is a healthcare executive and entrepreneur with more than 25 years of industry experience. Ludi's signature software, DocTime Log, is Gail's brainchild, having developed the platform in response to a significant yet unmet need she identified during her years as a health system executive. Prior to founding Ludi in 2012, she served as Vice President for Business Development at Vanguard Health Chicago, acquired by Tenet in 2013. Gail has also served in leadership roles at WebMD, Chicago-based SubBimo, acquired by WebMD in 2006, McNeil Hospital, and Saks Group, now Truven Health. Terry Metzger is Chief Financial Officer of St. Vincent, now a part of Ascension. Terry has nearly 20 years of financial expertise with a concentration on strategic management, revenue enhancement, and business growth. He joined the St. Vincent Ministry in 2016 as Regional Vice President of Finance. Previously, Terry has held CFO positions at a number of healthcare firms, including Advantage Health Solutions, Care Wisconsin, and Southwest Family Care Alliance. Additionally, he has held executive roles for Samperna Strategic Group, E-Kong Disticom Group, Zone Telecom, Matacom SA, and Spice Telecom. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to Gail to begin today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you joining in on the webinar this afternoon. I am very excited to have my colleague, Terry Metzger, share his story and his journey at St. Vincent's. And so we want to make sure we leave lots of time for his part of the discussion and the case study and Q&A. But before we get into that, I thought we would start with, I'll tee it up with a little bit about what we see in the market related to physician alignment with hospitals and physicians, and also what we're seeing in the industry in terms of cost cutting, et cetera. So if you've read the paper recently, you can't hardly pick it up without seeing something about the gross domestic product taking very quickly approaching 20% of our national spend. So healthcare is huge in our country. If you read the paper today, you probably saw a lot about the latest new candidate who's going to be running in the 2020 election, but let's narrow our discussion today just to healthcare. So one of the interesting things that we're starting to see is that what used to work for cost containment isn't working as well. Actually, Kaufman Hall released a really good study I'd encourage you to Google and take a look at this past year. But we need to think differently, and we need to think a little bit out of the box about how to manage our costs down and manage things correctly. At Ludi, we talk about 5 different market drivers, and those drivers strictly relate to the relationship between the physician and the hospital. And none of these will come as a surprise to you, I'm guessing. But we talk about these 5, and the first one is really not a surprise to you all on the phone in the healthcare side of things. People are trying to steal your doctors. There's so many different new entrants in the market, and there's different ways the physicians are aligning with different organizations, and they're highly sought after. Also, physician burnout is real. I see studies about that number coming down perhaps a little bit, but it's real, and it's in large part due to the large EHR rollouts we've done on the hospital side and making things about us getting paid correctly and putting a big burden on the doctors. On the OIG regulatory standpoint, again, no surprise to anybody here, when things go wrong with these physician contracts, they are very expensive. And it's just quite simply not worth the risk of running a risk of paying a physician incorrectly. We also see, of course, the hospital margins are thin everywhere, they're razor thin, and the need to cut costs. So we've defined a new category that we're titling physician spend. And this is any way you pay a doctor. So if you have a medical director of your cardiac cath lab and they have 10 hours a month that you're aligned with them, you have a contract, you pay them for that service, that's part of your spend, all the way through employment. So all of these different relationships are represented and memorialized with the contract with that doctor. And so all of those dollars add up and can be quite large when you step back and look at that spend in total. And we call this really a hidden opportunity. Many of you on the phone, I saw ahead of time a lot of C-suite executives today. And if you've been in your job in a hospital for less than 10 years and you're a C-suite exec, you're probably living with deals that the previous administration cut with doctors. So it's a really good idea to get in and get your arms around what are all of these alignment strategies we have, what is our total potential spend, what are we spending, do we still want to do this, is this really part of our ongoing strategy? All right, so where do all these dollars hide? Because we contract with physicians in so many different ways, they sit in silos throughout our organization. So employment contracts are pretty easy to find. You can go to HR, get your hands on them, you can look in payroll and see what you're paying those doctors. However, some of those physicians might also provide call coverage for you. They may be medical directors, and those services may require additional documentation that doctor provides you with each month. So the physician might be employed or they might be independent. Regardless, these all make up our physician spend. Think about things like our emergency rooms, anesthesia, pathology. Those are very large professional service agreements that we have with a physician group. There may be some component of a monthly stipend. There could be a scorecard you use to calculate how that doctor's paid. But all of these, my message here is there are very complex relationships with doctors, and these contracts are only getting more complex. But I like to keep things a little easier. So we think about paying physicians as one of three different workflows. And I can only think of three. So if anybody can think of a fourth, please do contact me after, either on LinkedIn or come to us at Ludi. So the first workflow would be when the doctor hands you something. They've performed a duty. I was the medical director. I did these 4 duties. I spent 6 hours this month. I handed in. That's the first workflow. The second workflow would come off of a calendar. Perhaps you have on-call services for a trauma center that are paid off a calendar. So someone at the organization looks at the calendar at the end of the month, checks to make sure that doctor should be paid X amount for that shift, making sure it calculated correctly, either it's a holiday or a regular day or an evening or day shift, and the doctor is paid off of that calendar submission. And then the third workflow is really everything else that you need to go get some information in order to pay. So this would be an incentive payment. Maybe you have a co-management deal and the physicians have the ability to share in the savings in some fashion at the end of the year, and it's tied to a bonus structure that's based on hitting certain metrics. So that workflow 3 usually involves somebody getting a metrics, calculating it against a contract, and then handing that payment in. So once you're ready to pay the physician, the payments run through 2 sides of your house, payroll and then accounts payable. So starting with the left side first. Payroll is pretty easy to get your arms around because you can go to it and find it. Some of those additional payments I discussed, on-call coverage perhaps, or medical directorship, that might be in addition to the physician's regular payroll. So again, the documentation might be submitted, but the payment may then run through payroll as opposed to through the AP side of the house. So on the AP side of the house, this is where things get messy. There's no easy way to go look in our current financial systems today and find all the physician payments. There's no source of truth for this. So I might have to pull a list of all of my AP for the past 2 years and try to find an MD, a DO, a professional corporation, or anything that looks like a group in order to be paid. So again, it hides in different buckets because it may be part of a service line. This teaching agreement may be part of our academic program or a residency program that we have. So they sit in all these different silos, which again, make it a little bit difficult to capture them together. So what's the big deal about it? Well, we like to say it's difficult to manage that which you do not measure. And the measurement of these contracts needs to be done not just at one point in time, but all the time. And let me share a quick personal story. I used to work at Vanguard Health Systems in the Chicago market, and I was responsible for strategy, physician alignment, anything to do with growth for our hospitals there. And we were working on our strategic plan one year, and we had a lot of changes in our leadership team, and we decided we would use an outside consultant to help us with our strategic plan. Part of that initiative was spent trying to get our arms around who we were aligned with. So how many physicians do we pay is a seemingly easy question, but is actually quite difficult in practice to go find. So we spent the better part of a quarter, 3 months, digging through our contracts, finding our contracts, digging through AP, looking at payroll, and trying to see what we were spending. And it was actually quite shocking when we saw that number in total. And it was great to know that at that moment in time, it impacted our strategic plan, but the problem was a week later, it was out of date. A month later, it was further out of date. So we call this at Ludi a blind spot. You're not protecting your organization by ignoring this bucket. And because it's spread around into so many different silos, it's difficult to get your arms around it. So how big is it really, Gail? I'm going to give you a quick formula for the CFOs on the phone. You guys can do this pretty fast. If you're an investor-owned hospital, go get your payroll number from payroll of any physician you're paying, all in. Take that number and multiply it by 1.2, and then add those two numbers together, and that's your total physician spend. If you're a not-for-profit hospital, go pull your payroll again, anybody you employ, and then multiply that number times 0.8. Add those two numbers together, and that's your total physician spend. We see nationally, investor-owned hospitals tend to have more creative alignment structures and a little bit less employment, and vice versa on the not-for-profit side. We tend to see a little more employment and a fewer of those kind of creative alignment structures, like, for example, co-management or something. So I think the net, what we want to get you thinking differently about today is that this is a very big bucket. And it's a bucket that's wrought with regulatory issues and strategy issues and risk for the leadership team. And it also is your clinical delivery of care. Who you choose to read your x-rays, who you choose to have cover call, who you choose to employ. These are big decisions. It is your delivery of care. So there's a lot of risk when you make these payments. Many of you on the phone already know this. I can't do one of these discussions without some type of a scare slide. So here's my Stark Law one. It's super easy to get sideways in these payments. Miss an annual maximum, miss a monthly maximum, accidentally pay the doctor from two different buckets and not know it was for the same duties, calculate something incorrectly, lose the documentation. There's just a tremendous amount of risk. All right, so this is going to be fun. On this slide, I'd like you to look at first for a quick second. This is a typical physician time log, and this is from one of our customers, and we've sort of blanked out, we've blurred out on purpose the stuff on the bottom, but can you read the middle part? That this physician has logged 4 hours of work, and this is part and parcel to the issue that we see today. And what I'd like to do now is ask you all a question, and we're going to start a poll. And I'd like to ask you all to answer the question, does your organization collect any kind of physician documentation on paper? Yes or no? If you're a consultant, please answer for the majority of your customers. So are you collecting any time from the physicians on paper? Okay, and it's looking like the poll-in process, it looks like 79% of you have told us that your organization is collecting this on paper. And that's actually a little bit better than I thought it was going to be, because our research shows closer to, and north of 90% of the organizations out there are still collecting time on paper. And we had some not sure, and that doesn't surprise me. Another thing that happens in our organizations is we push this responsibility really far down into the service lines, into the day-to-day line managers. And if you're an executive and you don't know how your physicians are getting paid, or you're not personally signing off on these payments, it's probably worth your time to go figure out what path they're taking as they make their way around to get paid. So this is great research. I thank you all for that. Excellent. Okay, so let me go with one more slide here. I think in general, we get very hung up on the process of getting those payments made to doctors for their call, for their co-management, measuring the report cards, that we never step back and look at this total expenditure. And so, back to my story at Vanguard, we knew what we were spending at that moment in time across each of these strategies, and we knew we wanted to change some things up. We wanted to put a little more focus on cardiovascular services, a little bit less on ortho. So that means we need to change those dollars around. And then another question might be, is it still relevant to have a medical director of a program 40 hours a month if it's been going for 10 years? Should that be 20 hours a month? So those little changes add up to a lot of money. And my message today is that all of this starts at a very, very granular level. It's hour by hour that doctor works for you. You have to collect it at that level in order to get to the big view that we're talking about, which is the total spend. So what I'd like to do now is shift and give you 5 best practices to leverage your physician data. The first practice is to go find all your contracts. And this is a seemingly easy task, but it's surprisingly difficult. And so most organizations today have a contract management system. Go to that, it usually sits in legal, and pull all of your physician contracts. And that'll get you probably somewhere between 50 and 70% where you need to be. The next step is the harder part. And for those finance folks on the phone who've been through a merger or acquisition, this is what we do on the acquisition side. We get 5 years of the AP data, and we go look for any payment that went to a physician, a PC, a DO, an MD, a group, and then we go back and try to find a root contract. If you have a payment going to a physician without a contract, it can stop a merger. It can also, and it generally is, a problem, a regulatory problem. So really a good practice is to find all your contracts and get your arms around them, and then dive into that spend is the second practice. So really look at the dollars you're spending. It's always larger than you think, and it may surprise you that you're spending more on orthopedics than you thought you were. Or, gosh, we started a neurosurgery program 5 years ago, and we knew we put a big investment in, but why is that still our biggest investment? Should it be? And I don't have the answers. And each year, as you look at this data, you may want to change some of these relationships based on how you see your physicians moving the quality needle, for example. It's going to require you to have tough conversations. Is this the best use of our money? But it is a good practice to review this every year. And if you're dialing in, say, from an investor-owned system, it's not uncommon that part of the management operating review that happens monthly, at a minimum annually, every single physician contract is reviewed with that leadership team. Do we still need it? Is it the right amount of hours? And so this dollar, this amount can really be bigger than we think. The third recommended practice is to gain visibility into who you're paying, so what has been paid and what has yet to be paid. And from a financial standpoint, this is how we run our lives. This is how we run our organizations, how we run our hospitals. And what's very tricky, if you're dependent on doctors handing you pieces of paper and then finance keeping batches of different spreadsheets to try to figure out, to track this, there's no way to really foot it back to what you thought you were going to spend. And there's no good way to manage your accruals. And I know Terry's going to talk about that a little bit later. But really, this is visibility into who we're aligned with. This is economic alignment, who you choose to partner with on the physician side. And again, it can be a really big bucket. So the fourth recommendation is to track this bucket of investment. How can we do it better? Each of these contracts should be looked at each year. And then with the physician, this is kind of an interesting story. When I started the business 7 years ago, we didn't see a lot of what we call evergreen contracts. So we saw a lot of physician medical directorships, for example, that were a 2-year agreement, and then they ended on the date. And the hospital might have been pretty bad at catching when that contract ended, and then they kept paying the doctor. They kept submitting their time. So then they changed to evergreens. The legal department started saying, well, let's make every contract an evergreen so we don't have a Stark law risk. Well, that's good on that side to prevent you from having the risk, but it's bad because it never makes you stop and think, should I still be paying this physician? Do I still want this physician to have 40 hours a month? So having a hard end to your contract kind of gives you an opportunity to discuss that. So I'd like to do another poll and ask you all this question. After you set up a physician agreement, do you sit down and review that contract with the physician again before renewing it? Do you literally have a conversation with that doctor before you renew that contract? Excellent. This is so fun to see real-time data. Okay, so it looks like close to 65% of you, 65% of you are sitting down and reviewing that. That is excellent. Okay, and here's my theory. Because you all joined this phone call today, you're already aware of the spend and the alignment with the physicians as being important. I think that you guys might be a little bit on the trend-setting side of the business. We see this number typically quite a bit lower in terms of renewing these. So this is excellent. I'm really glad you guys are doing that and diving in, because it really does offer us the opportunity to sit down and say, okay, is this the right set of tasks? Is this the right number of hours? And then think again about our costs. If we shave off 2% of the expense each year, that can be millions of dollars. And if you're a large system, it can be approaching $1 billion if you're shaving off those expenses. So thank you all for that quick poll. Okay, so one more slide, one more practice. So here's my last piece of advice. Automate where possible. And think about this sort of in 3 buckets. Today, I think a lot of us are still using, well, 79% of you today, and I think probably a great number more, are using manual-based systems to collect documentation from doctors, to remember to go calculate incentive payments, to pay off calendar systems. A lot of this is manual, typing up check requests, trying to calculate things by hand. The negative of this is that it takes a lot of staff time. It's dissatisfying to your physicians. There's compliance risk, but you also could be leaving reimbursement on the table. And so today, when you're in a manual-based system and you think about automation, you think, oh, that's a cost to me. I think that you're being a little bit short-sighted if you think it's a cost, because what it's costing you today on the negative side is quite substantial. So where possible, find a software solution. And what we recommend doing on the far right is actually what Ludy's in the business of doing. We help systems, hospitals, organize and fix the underlying payment process and streamline and standardize, streamline, standardize, streamline, standardize, so that it happens the same way every time. The positive of that is that it's going to save you a lot of rework, staff time. It's going to make it very satisfying to your physicians to be transparent. It's going to eliminate math errors and really get you out of that compliance risk bucket. And so, you know, the negative is sometimes people say, well, I've got to make an investment in order to do that. And I think, again, where we are in the market today, we need to think outside the box. We can't keep doing the same things and expect a different outcome. And this part of our business has gotten really big. Almost half the physicians in this country are employed. Half. So when I was in the hospital world 7 years ago, that number was something like 30%. So this is big dollars. It's a big investment, and we need to really make sure we're doing our best to pay our physician partners at all times the very correct amount in the most expedient way possible, and making it very streamlined for them. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Terry Metzger, and have him talk a little bit about his journey at St. Vincent's. And every time I talk to him, I learn something new. I learn a new process, and I just think he has a great story of a step-by-step journey. You know, you can't do this overnight. So, Terry, we look forward to hearing your story.
Thanks, Gail. The slide there kind of lays out some of the background for you. We have 20 hospitals across the state of Indiana, and well over 400 physician agreements. Some of our challenges were similar to the things that Gail was describing, but we also had a point where finance actually wasn't even receiving all the agreements, because we were moving fast on a lot of the setup of these independent physician agreements to make sure we had the proper services in place. Sometimes we're even learning about them when someone looked to get paid. that it was falling through the cracks at that point. And we wanted to really put some processes in place to get our arms around it. And we said, let's start with our big quaternary care facility. We have a trauma center in Indianapolis. It's a campus environment with 5 hospitals. We said, let's start there. If we can tackle that location with all the call related to our big trauma center, and we can get our arms around that, then we think that this is a good product for us, and we can roll it out to the rest of the locations. And we really wanted to establish some standardized processes around all of our physician payments. We were delaying payments in some cases because our paper processes were documents sitting around in someone's office and we're not sure where they're at. Simple things like that are really upsetting some of our key physician relationships. And then we really wanted to better understand the spend and be able to identify some of these agreements with various service lines or programs that we were running to ensure we could really get a solid ROI in some of these things. And then lastly, this is probably what started the process for us was really compliance risk. That's what got us to the table to look at this, but we started setting some other goals and having additional expectations as we were moving forward. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I'm going to start with that. I'll touch on that last bullet point first, and then go through the rest of these bullet points. But Pam Hess is one of my colleagues within Ascension, and she was further along than I was and implemented this at our Nashville, Tennessee, St. Thomas location, another quaternary care large facility. And she said to me, and I talked to her about implementing it, she said, this is not an easy implementation if you do it right. There's some lift to it. And a big value, part of that value is investing in that process. So when we went into this, we started with that in mind. So we said, all right, let's scrub every contract. We're not going to just send them on over and get it loaded. We're really going to take the time to review those. And what really helped us is as we were starting to work to load these, and our controller was part of our implementation team, we saw, and Ludi helped us see, quite honestly, where there were weaknesses in our agreements. The language wasn't tight. We left room for interpretation. There were just poorly written agreements, and those were identified. So immediately we said, let's create a work group essentially to review these, and that included our COO and our Chief Medical Officer. And that group would meet, and we'd get some feedback from Ludi, and we'd sit down and go through 3 or 4 contracts at a time and read through them. And we'd bring in even some of our own physicians and leadership and say, how would you interpret this? How would you write this, to make sure we could create a better process as we scrub those contracts. And that was very beneficial. Locating the contracts, again, this isn't, we discovered kind of a part of the process of why we knew we needed to improve and look at an automated system is we had some areas that were implementing agreements very rapidly. The agreements were in compliance, but they were not even passed through finance. They might have gone through legal, but for some reason didn't get to finance. So we wanted to really shore that up, and this helped us sort of create that process and identify through our contracting group to make sure that it passed through and would get loaded directly into doc time as we would go forward. And that gave us an easier process to implement and a way to check it off. The next piece around physician acceptance, we were concerned about this right from the beginning because we knew our physicians were quite busy and they really didn't like change. So knowing they were change adverse and we're implementing a new process where they're going to be able to enter it right on their smartphone or have a technology enabled interface rather than sending us paper that we couldn't often read. Our Chief Medical Officer was engaged right from the beginning. We brought in chairs, department chairs. We did presentations where our Chief Medical Officer led that with department chairs, got people excited about it, really started to tell them about the benefits of it, how it's going to make it easier for them. They'll be more compliant, we'll be more compliant. We'll make sure that it flows through the payment processes so you won't have these delays in your payments that could happen. And that really went much better than I thought. We were expecting a lot of pushback there, but there was really universal acceptance that was quite positive, and our chief medical officer did a great job with that. And then on to the next slide here, some of our aha moments. So really, we were able to now start seeing what our costs were related to our trauma program, and really understand some of our agreements and really identify where we had a few that evergreen agreements that needed to be cleaned up and eliminated. So that was a real opportunity for us to get a better idea of our spending and reducing cost through having a better idea of these call agreements. And in one instance, we actually found a physician that had been billing us call for two different hospital locations. And because we were loading it and we were able to demonstrate, we were showing one of our outlying hospitals where they were going to be next on the implementation. And we showed them the product and they were like, wait a second, I know that physician. What are they billing you on that call pay? I have them too. So it immediately, right while we were going through the process, was paying some dividends for us. And then it also allowed us to really have an electronic process, technology solution, and get rid of a lot of the paper. There was way too much paper in tracking it, and our controller and accounting managers walking around the large facilities trying to find who is next on the list to approve a payment, whose desk it was sitting on. This really helped us clean that whole process up and have time logs that were entered right into the system and easily processed. We also gained visibility into some of the other areas of what had been paid and was yet to be paid. So this goes back to accruals. So we can now print directly out of the APQ on the DocTime product, and we use it to do our accruals. So we weren't even able to get a good idea of that. We were accruing, but we weren't accruing as precisely as we needed to. And what we found is we were over accruing, sometimes under accruing, and other times because we really weren't sure. So we're trying to cover ourselves. So, but with the product now, it makes it quite easy. Our controller loves using this product because he can just go right down through and see where it is in the process. And in fact, it helps him kind of clean up the process. We'll get emails to say, this is sitting in your queue. Get it cleaned up, make a decision, so we can get this through the process and also get this physician paid on time. We've also created far more standardization. The approvals are made more efficiently. We're able to create a clean handoff for a payment, and it's also easier for us to onboard new people into the process. So as we bring in new people into the organization, and we recently put a new VP, installed a new VP of finance at our Indianapolis campus, we were able to sit down and say, here, you can go right in, you can see, here's all your call agreements. This is the section here for your Trauma One program. Now you can see what the language is on the contract. You can pull up the contract. You can see where we're at in the payment process. You can see when the renewal is due on this agreement, so you can queue up the right people to determine whether we want to renew, renegotiate, etc. And it's in one spot. So that's made it a lot easier to retain that information and onboard a new leader into the process. Lastly, obviously, our compliance team is much happier. We get our compliance department involved in these pieces as we're implementing them, get their recommendations, and then they review as we go back and have implemented and have received good feedback from the compliance team as well. And we're now in the implementation for our other hospitals in the North region, the South region of the state.
Excellent. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I love hearing a CFO talk about compliance. It warms my heart, Terry. Let me do a quick recap. This is Gail again. Before we go to the Q&A portion of today, we wanted to present today just some thinking for you around this whole big bucket of spend, why it matters, and that it's a really big exercise, but well worth it, to to start on that journey to providing transparency into what you're spending in what area, for what type of agreement. It allows you, as Terry said, to manage your service lines differently, to look at your trauma center ROI, for example, or really all parts of this strategy, all parts of your ROI related to that. So I think Terry said it best when he talked about starting this journey. I was thinking about the Masters last weekend. I'm a big golf fan. And, Tiger Woods didn't come back after 10 years. He didn't just hop off the couch and win a Masters last weekend. It was through hard work. And so, like anything we do, this is a journey. It needs to be organized. It's a whole new category that we probably haven't been thinking about in the hospital world in the way that we should be thinking about it. But by doing the right thing and putting our contracts into an organized fashion and automating things and making it easier for our staff to go, we can also save money and do the right thing along the way. So with that, I'd like to turn it to our moderator, Brian, and let him start in on the questions for us.
Thank you, Gail, Terry, for that excellent presentation. And we will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. All right, so we got some good questions rolling in here. We'll go with this one first. Prior to implementing dock time log, did St. Vincent Health ever have systems in place to catch things like physician contract maximums? What was your reason for changing and moving to a technology automation system like dock time log?
Sure. So we were trying to track that on spreadsheets. So we had a process we were implementing or had implemented, and we're tracking it on spreadsheets, which was very cumbersome, not very accurate. And that, I'll tell you, when I asked my controller as well, just thinking about this meeting, I said, tell me your favorite things about this product, how it's improved for you. And he said, the automatic calculations of maximums. That's the most easiest part for him to use and have at his fingertips. So that was definitely one of the key pieces why we wanted to implement this.
Great, thank you. And so we got some more questions coming in, and this audience member wants to know, who did you find to be the best champion or advocate for the technology you put in place? Was it yourself or someone in a completely different role?
So in the beginning, I was the one driving the process, but after I introduced it to our COO and Chief Medical Officer, they were the real champions of the process. I thought as we were going into this that they'd say, oh, geez, this is a big lift, a lot of work. Are we going to get value? But the process that we went through of just review with Ludi and the feedback we got back on the contracts, we all looked at each other and said in several meetings, like, wow, how'd this get through? How have we been working with this agreement? And they really appreciated that and feel a lot better about the agreements we have in place and are much more engaged in the renewal processes now than they were in the past. And our Chief Medical Officer as well personally went around as an advocate to talk to independent physicians about, hey, this is going to really help and this is how it works. So they ended up being really, really big champions of it, those two.
Thank you, Terry. That's helpful to understand. And I'm getting word now that Gail actually has a question for you, Terry. So part of the ROI for solutions like dock time log is staff time saved and streamlining, but most CFOs tend to dismiss this part of ROI. What are your thoughts on that?
So I would agree. I completely dismissed that going into this process and said, if I can get the compliance and some of these other pieces, I'll be happy with that. But we actually have seen that, and we feel right now, and I checked again with our controller as we were going forward, because I'm looking at my implementation into other regions or where my cost savings opportunities are as I get ready for my fiscal year 20 budget. Just for the central region, we know minimally we saved an FTE there, and that's being conservative. So we know minimally we save that and more on that side, but it's hard to quantify some of the the other people we had chasing around contracts and looking for them, and the dissatisfaction elements, and quantifying some of that. But we definitely saved some labor costs for sure in the process too.
So Terry, that was on the finance side. That was an FTA from finance, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent.
Staff accountant, full equivalent FTE staff accountant. Yeah.
Thank you. That's powerful.
And we'll move on to the next audience question here. So, what was the feedback from the physician network throughout the process? Was there any pushback?
Yeah, well, we tried to get out in front of it early. So we did 3 months before we ever started the launch. We went to the all the physician committee meetings. We start with the physician executive committee meeting. We got that group on board. Once they were comfortable, we asked them to take it back to their departments. Then we did a follow-up meeting where myself and our chief medical officer would go back to their physician group meetings or physician department meetings. I think that we kept telling them, here's what's coming. There was some pushback from a few there, but not as much as I would have even thought. I was expecting a lot more, but when they heard it really from our chief medical officer and their department chairs, getting them on board first, that made the big difference. It wasn't really the initial message isn't coming from me, the accountant, saying this is a new process you have to do, as much as coming from the fellow physician saying, this is going to make it easier for you to get this log. You're going to get paid more timely and more efficiently, and we're going to be able to tell you at any time where any payment is and where it is in the process. They saw the value of that.
Great, that's helpful to understand. And Terry, I think you can take this one as well. So from an internal perspective, who was key in helping you implement the DocTime technology?
Sure. So what we did, in some good advice from Pam Hess, is we pulled together our controller, our chief operating officer for that campus, our chief medical officer for that campus, and myself. We were sort of the strategic leaders of it. And then we broke into some smaller groups. There was one in terms of communication with physicians, and that was really specifically myself and our chief medical officer working through directors and the various physician groups. Then we got some of the financial analysts together to work on collecting and reviewing and tracking down the contracts and working with our contract group. Now go forward, as a go forward strategy, we engaged our contract group differently as well. So that way we capture everything up front and we don't have things sliding through. So we got that group involved in the beginning as well, our contract group. And then our compliance manager was engaged in the process from the beginning as well. He didn't sit through all the meetings, but what we would say is here's our thoughts on implementation. Give us your feedback. So he was engaged. And those were the key leaders right there.
Excellent. And so our next question here, Gail, you might want to take this one. So regarding practice number 5, automate where possible, would this solution be running a parallel system to the organization payroll?
Oh, sure. Perfect question. So this solution is not a payroll solution. So we don't set up vacation accruals and time off and those things. What the DocTime log software does is it calculates anything that's part of that physician's pay that's not just straight hourly rate. So if there is documentation required for their medical directorship hours, those 10 hours, for example, our software would hand that off to the payroll system. Please pay 10 additional hours, and then the tracking would be contained in DocTime. So it's things that are above and outside of the actual payroll itself. The payroll system is how it's actually paid, and we're doing the collection of the documentation for the approval behind, et cetera. And Terry, did I say that right? he's my check on that.
Yes, yep, yes, I'd agree.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And so the next question here is, what kind of metrics or KPIs are important to tracking physician ROI and investment?
I'll start this one. How's that? And then you go, Terry. So, this is the million-dollar question, and I think it depends on what your system appetite is for this as well. I know that when I used to do let's say a business plan to add, I'm thinking about a particular incident at Vanguard where we added a pain center. So I set up freestanding pain centers, bought a C-arm, did a build out on a location, and I found a private group that would provide the services on the professional side, and then the hospital would do the facility side billing. And so I set up for us a business plan and a whole payback that was 2 years on those clinics. And the interesting thing is I came from the majority of my background is the investor-owned side. And we are so disciplined in putting together business plans and proposals and IRRs and ROIs. But once we started those pain centers, no one ever came back a year later and said, hey, Gail, how's that going? And so that's what my point is to this whole discussion. That's the last loop that we didn't close because we got so hung up in trying to make the payments and make sure everything was happening and running on to the next, thing that was shiny. We never stopped and said, okay, well, we said we'd pay that off in 2 years. Did we actually achieve it? So I think it's kind of personal what the KPIs would be, but, we see numbers like on the employment side, what is the loss per employed physician? Those things are monitored, et cetera. So there's a whole lot of different calculations that go into that loss, for example, but that would be one example of something I'd watch in my system. I'd watch, my volume. So it would be, certainly very personal. And Terry, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think for us, what we were able to get specifically to the implementation of this product was around our trauma program. So we could go through other systems we have in place, DRG by DRG, and I could get my cost for some of these pieces. But relative to what was just these call agreements, I couldn't nail down, and now I could. So I could get a better idea. It helped complete the picture for me.
Thanks, Gail and Terry. So our next question here is, what's the percentage of net revenue for a health system for physicians spent in a closed medical staff model?
I am not sure I would have that top at my fingertips, to be quite honest with you.
That's fair.
Well, yeah, I mean, they would probably be quite a bit higher, but I'm happy to follow up with who that is. And a lot of times I go to some of the outside resources, and in fact, there's a handful of consultants on this call right now. A lot of times I'll go to the Coker Group or something like that, or Navicent, or one of the valuation companies. And some of the benchmark data that I use a lot is MD Ranger. I like their survey data. I like their data better because it's not straight survey data on the medical directorships and on-call benchmarking, but I'll have to follow up on that one because I'm not sure I'd have a percent on that off the top of my head. Terry, I don't know that you would either.
I'm afraid I don't.
Thank you. And so this next question, this audience member would like to know if either of you can comment on these initiatives and how they operate within an academic medical center.
Sure. I'll start and then I'll let Terry join in. So I think anytime you're paying a physician and that physician has documented something for you, this applies. So in the academic world, it gets exponentially complex around, am I doing research at the moment? Am I in clinical care? Am I doing my admin time, or am I teaching? And so I think this product would apply anytime you're trying to measure some component of work that a doctor's doing and make sure you do that payment correctly. Or even on the schedule-based work that we talked about, like on call, anytime you have a shift and you're running calendar and shift and then making payments for those shifts, the payments are based on a contracted rate that's different per doctor, hourly rate that's different per doctor. Anytime you're doing those kind of calculations, I think it applies. So that would be my first top of mind. Terry, do you have anything to add on your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess we're not necessarily an academic center, but our the campus I was describing where we did the implementation, we do have a residency program where we have 179 residents. And I'd say on the faculty side, where we use the product for that too, where we have so many where they're I'm 0.4 this, 0.4 this, and 0.2 this. Those were virtually taken for face value and accepted because we didn't have a real good way of tracking it, quite honestly. And now we're able to nail that down considerably. And these residency programs are very expensive, at least for us. So it really helped us nail down some of those split relationships like that.
You know, you bring up a point, Terry. You reminded me of another application I was thinking about in another group that we work with, where the employed physicians came to us and said, hey, we service all of our hospitals in our system. And now that we're employed, everybody and their brother needs a medical director of this, that, and the other. And we don't think they have a sense of how much they're tapping us. So the physician group implemented DocTime to track their own administrative time. And then that helped them, again, go back to the system and negotiate, is this, this really how you want us spending half of our time? But I think, Terry, you're pointing something out that's important. If it's 0.4, 0.2, 0.1, do we know that's right? I mean, we run so much in our industry off samples, time study samples. And if it's easy enough to track your time, I mean, I don't want to push the whole at 6-minute increments like my team does for all the work that we do on the consulting side. But if, we really should know, is it 10% administrative time for all employed physicians, or is it 15, or is it 20? And that it has huge dollar impact on the system. I think that's a great point.
Thank you both for that insightful feedback. And so our next question here is, would you consider physician spend to also include staffing and practice overhead costs?
No, I don't describe physician spend as that way. I describe it as the contract and then any dollar you'd pay the doctor. I wouldn't pull in my overhead costs on the practice itself or the clinics. No, I keep it cleaner because it's also so high risk. There's so many regulations about how much you can pay a doctor. It has to be fair market value. And it's really dangerous to blow past all of those limits that your contract has, and it's easy to do on paper. So I would say, really, when I describe physician spend, keeping it really organic to what you're paying to the doctor only makes it's a little cleaner. I would say maybe your physician strategy investment, that this would be one piece of that, and then your clinics and your staff, that would all be part of that physician strategy. I don't know, Terry, if you describe it differently.
No, that's how we've implemented it today.
Great. And so we got some more questions coming in here. And this audience member would like to know, what type of metrics do you require for RVU bonus configuration?
So I'll take this one first. So this is I'm assuming for an employed physician who has an RVU component to their contract. Usually, as you set up your relationship with that doctor, you would go to market, or you'd have a process at your system of what your system's comfortable with paying physicians, and what portion of that could be tied to RVUs or some template that you're using and working off of. So I would say there's just probably hundreds of different ways you can structure these, and I don't know if I would be the best source to tell you exactly how to set it up. But regardless of how you set it up, what I'd like to give you the confidence of, whatever you decide, track it in DocTime log, because then you're going to make sure, okay, this RVU bonus is going to hit after they hit a threshold of this, and then they can receive a 10% bonus, or if it's a rate per RVU above that. I would say the ones that I've seen and we've dealt with are more like that, where I have a quarterly target. If I exceed that threshold of 2,500 RVUs, I'll then be paid a higher rate per RVU beyond. On the full productivity contracts would be my rate. But there's probably hundreds of different ways you could do that.
Great. And so our next question here is, how much does it cost to implement the DocTime mobile solution? Is there a monthly fee based on the number of physicians, or is it a flat fee?
I think that's a good question. I'll take that one. So what we like to do is learn a little bit more about each hospital, but it's based on the number of contracts that you're going to be managing in the software is the fastest way to say it. There's a one-time implementation fee, and then it's an annual license agreement. And it's a SaaS model, software as a service. So once you get implemented, then past that point, you manage all your own contracts in the software if you like. If you don't have the staff to do that and you'd like us to do it ongoing, we'll do that too in a service bureau kind of fashion where we'll load all your new contracts for you in future. But it's very open-ended, the system itself. And so what we like to do is get in and look at your contracts and get some of your templates and really sharpen our pencil and have a look from there. So, we'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in that as a next step.
Wonderful. And so we're coming up on the end of the hour here. So this will be our last question. And this audience member wants to know, what is a benchmark for hospital overhead applied to employed physician models?
Benchmark for physician overhead. I don't think I'm going to have that. I'm going to have to follow up with you on that one, just like the other one on the faculty-based side. Would you have any thoughts on that, Terry?
Yeah, I don't. It really depends too. And my specialty is quite different as well, but I don't.
Well,
but I know a lot of people who do. Yeah.
Well, before we close here, Gail, Terry, do either of you have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank Terry for his willingness to have this conversation, and discussion today. I'm very impressed with what St. Vincent is doing and what they're rolling out. And 20 hospitals is a big book of business. And so I'm really impressed with what you guys are doing.
Thank you. Yeah, we
right.
have gotten a lot of traction with it, and we're in the implementation of our other regions right now, and I know several of our other Ascension hospitals are going that direction as well. So I've had similar conversations with my colleagues within Ascension as well.
Great. So that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Gail Peace and Terry Metzger for sharing their insights and our audience for participating. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.